now, your brain is lying to you about why you buy things, and you have no idea. If you've ever bought something to feel better, to celebrate, or to fill some unnamed emptiness inside you, if you've ever stood in a store holding an item you don't really need, feeling that familiar pull to purchase it anyway, then what I'm about to share will explain patterns you've noticed, but never understood. In the next 55 minutes, you'll discover why emotional spending operates exactly like an addiction, hijacking the same neural pathways as drugs and alcohol. You'll understand how your brain has been programmed to seek relief through purchases, and why breaking free requires more than just willpower. But first, I need to tell you about a woman named Sarah, standing in Target at 2 a.m., her cart full of things she doesn't need, tears streaming down her face. Because her story, and the neuroscience behind it, will change how you see every purchase you've ever made. Whether you're fully focused right now, or simply letting this play in the background while you work, rest, or drift to sleep, your subconscious mind is listening. The gentle frequencies woven into this audio are designed to quietly reprogram your relationship with money and abundance. So there's no need to concentrate. Just relax. Let the words and frequencies do their work. Your mind will absorb what it needs. Sarah's husband had just asked for a divorce. The papers were on the kitchen table. The house felt impossibly quiet. And somehow, she found herself driving to the 24-hour Target, telling herself she needed laundry detergent. But laundry detergent doesn't explain the throw pillows in her cart, or the candles, or the picture frames for photos she doesn't have. Sarah isn't shopping for things she needs. She's shopping for a feeling her brain has learned to associate with the act of buying. This is emotional spending, and it's far more sophisticated and far more dangerous than most people realize. When we think about addiction, we picture obvious substances: alcohol, drugs, nicotine. We rarely consider that the same neural pathways, the same dopamine loops, the same desperate search for relief can be triggered by something as simple as adding items to an online shopping cart. But here's what researchers have discovered. The brain doesn't distinguish between the chemical high of cocaine and the neurological reward of a purchase. Both flood your system with dopamine. Both create anticipation, followed by a brief high, followed by a crash that leaves you wanting more. Dr. Kit Yarrow, a consumer psychologist, has spent decades studying this phenomenon. Her research reveals something startling. Emotional spending activates the same brain regions as gambling addiction, the same areas that light up when someone with a substance abuse problem sees their drug of choice. Think about your last impulse purchase. Not the practical one, the emotional one. The thing you bought because you were stressed, or sad, or celebrating, or just feeling empty. Do you remember the moment before you bought it? That anticipation? That sense that this purchase would somehow change how you felt? That wasn't weakness. That wasn't lack of self-control. That was your brain following a pattern it has learned. A pattern that promises relief from whatever emotion you're trying to escape or enhance. Section 1. The dopamine trap. Let's start with the neuroscience, because understanding what's happening in your brain is the first step to recognizing when it's happening. Dopamine is often misunderstood. People think it's the pleasure chemical, the thing that makes you feel good when you get what you want. But that's not quite right. Dopamine isn't about pleasure. It's about anticipation. It's about the promise of reward. When you see something you want to buy, your brain doesn't wait for the purchase to release dopamine. It releases it the moment you imagine owning that thing. The moment you picture how it will make you feel, how it will change your life, how it will solve whatever problem you're facing. That's when the dopamine floods your system. This is why browsing online stores can feel so addictive. You're not just looking at products. You're triggering dopamine release after dopamine release, imagining purchase after purchase, feeling that anticipation high over and over again. But here's the cruel irony. The actual purchase almost never lives up to the anticipation. The dopamine high peaks before you buy, not after. This is why so many purchases feel disappointing once you actually own them. Your brain was chasing the anticipation, not the object. Dr. Robert Sapolsky, a Stanford neuroscientist, explains it this way. Dopamine is not about pleasure. It's about the anticipation of pleasure. And the bigger the gap between anticipation and reality, the more your brain will seek that next hit. This creates what researchers call the hedonic treadmill. You need bigger and more frequent purchases to achieve the same emotional relief, just like any addiction. Consider Maria, a marketing executive who started buying clothes online during stressful workdays. At first, a $30 dress would give her that emotional lift. But over time, $30 stopped working. Then $50, then $100. Within 2 years, she was buying designer pieces she couldn't afford, chasing the same feeling that used to come from a simple purchase. The progression is predictable. First, you buy occasionally when you're upset. Then you buy when you're stressed. Then you buy when you're bored. Eventually, you're buying to maintain emotional equilibrium. Not to feel good, but to avoid feeling bad. This is the hallmark of addiction: tolerance, escalation, and using the substance. In this case, purchasing. Not for pleasure, but to return to baseline emotional functioning. But emotional spending has an advantage over traditional addictions. It's socially acceptable, even encouraged. We live in a culture that tells us we deserve nice things, that we should treat ourselves, that shopping is self-care. Retailers understand this psychology better than most people understand themselves. They've spent billions of dollars researching exactly how to trigger your dopamine system. The layout of stores, the placement of products, the timing of sales, none of it is accidental. Amazon's one-click purchasing isn't just convenient. It's designed to bypass the rational part of your brain, to capture you in that moment of dopamine-fueled anticipation before second thoughts can interfere. Flash sales create artificial scarcity, triggering your brain's loss aversion, the fear that if you don't buy now, you'll miss out forever. This activates the same fight-or-flight response that kept our ancestors alive, except now it's being used to sell you things you don't need. Even the language of retail has been weaponized. Treat yourself. You deserve this. Life's too short not to buy it. These aren't just marketing slogans. They're psychological triggers designed to override your rational decision-making process. The most insidious part is how this programming starts. Children as young as 3 begin associating purchases with emotional regulation. They see adults buying things when they're upset, celebrating with shopping trips, using material objects to express love and care. By the time we're adults, the pattern is so deeply ingrained that we don't even recognize it as learned behavior. We think it's just how we are. We think we just like nice things, or we're just not good with money, or we just have expensive taste. But it's none of those things. It's a conditioned response, as automatic as pulling your hand away from a hot stove. And like any conditioned response, it can be unlearned. Section 2. Stress spending and the cortisol connection. Sarah's story didn't begin in that target. It began months earlier, when work stress started building, when her marriage started showing cracks, when small disappointments began accumulating like sediment in her nervous system. She didn't wake up one day and decide to develop a shopping addiction. She developed it the same way most people do. One stressful day at a time, one small purchase at a time, one moment of relief at a time. Stress spending is perhaps the most common form of emotional purchasing, and it's rooted in a hormonal response that's as old as humanity itself. When you're stressed, your body releases cortisol. This hormone served our ancestors well. It provided the energy needed to escape predators or fight threats. But in modern life, our stressors are rarely physical. They're psychological, emotional, social, and cortisol doesn't know the difference. Here's what cortisol does to your brain. It shuts down the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for rational decision-making, and amplifies the limbic system, the area responsible for emotional responses and immediate gratification. In other words, when you're stressed, you literally cannot think as clearly. Your brain becomes biased toward immediate relief, immediate reward, immediate escape from whatever is causing the stress. Dr. Mauricio Delgado, a neuroscientist at Rutgers University, has studied this phenomenon extensively. His research shows that people under stress make purchasing decisions up to 60% faster than when they're calm. They also spend significantly more money and are far more likely to buy things they later regret. But stress spending isn't random. It follows predictable patterns based on what psychologists call compensatory consumption, buying things that symbolically address whatever is making you feel powerless or out of control. If you're feeling overwhelmed at work, you might buy organizational tools or productivity gadgets. If you're feeling unattractive, you might buy clothes or cosmetics. If you're feeling disconnected from others, you might buy gifts or experiences. The purchases aren't really about the objects themselves. They're about the story you tell yourself about what those objects will do for your life. Consider David, a software engineer who started buying expensive kitchen gadgets during a particularly stressful project at work. He told himself he was investing in healthier cooking, but he rarely used the gadgets. What he was really buying was the fantasy of a calmer, more organized life. A life where he had time to cook elaborate meals, where stress didn't exist. The kitchen gadgets became symbols of the person he wanted to be, rather than tools for the person he actually was. This is why stress spending is so seductive. It offers a momentary escape from reality into a version of yourself that doesn't have the problems you're currently facing. But there's another layer to stress spending that's even more insidious. It creates the very stress it promises to relieve. Every purchase made under emotional duress carries a hidden cost. Not just the financial cost, but the psychological cost of knowing, on some level, that you're not in control of your own behavior. This creates what researchers call financial stress, which is different from other kinds of stress because it's self-perpetuating. The more you spend to relieve stress, the more financial pressure you create, which generates more stress, which triggers more spending. Dr. Brad Klontz, a financial psychologist, has identified this as one of the most destructive cycles in personal finance. He calls it retail therapy relapse, the pattern of using shopping to cope with stress, feeling guilty about the spending, and then shopping more to cope with the guilt. The guilt itself becomes a trigger for more emotional spending. You buy something you can't afford, feel bad about it, and then buy something else to make yourself feel better about feeling bad. This is why traditional budgeting advice often fails for emotional spenders. The problem isn't that they don't know how to manage money. The problem is that they're using money to manage emotions. And until you address the emotional patterns, the financial patterns will persist. But here's what's hopeful about understanding stress spending. Once you recognize it as a stress response rather than a character flaw, you can begin to develop alternative strategies for stress management. The key is catching yourself in that moment between feeling stressed and reaching for your wallet. That moment, when cortisol is flooding your system and your prefrontal cortex is going offline. In that moment, you have a choice. Not an easy choice, but a choice nonetheless. You can follow the familiar pattern of seeking relief through purchase, or you can pause and ask yourself, what am I really trying to buy here? Because what you're trying to buy is never actually for sale. Section 3. Identity-based purchases and the self. We're trying to become the most expensive purchases we make aren't for things we need. They're for people we want to become. Every object carries a story about identity. The car you drive tells a story about your success, your values, your place in the world. The clothes you wear tell a story about your style, your personality, your aspirations. The phone you carry tells a story about your tech savviness, your financial status, your priorities. We don't just buy objects. We buy the stories those objects tell about who we are. This is what psychologists call identity-based consumption, and it's one of the most powerful drivers of emotional spending. Because when you're buying an identity, price becomes almost irrelevant. You can't put a price tag on becoming the person you want to be. Dr. Russell Belk, a consumer behavior researcher, has spent decades studying this phenomenon. His work reveals something fascinating. People form emotional attachments to objects not because of what the objects do, but because of what the objects say about who they are. Think about your most prized possessions. Chances are, their value to you has little to do with their practical function, and everything to do with what they represent about your identity. But here's where identity-based spending becomes dangerous. It's based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how identity actually works. We think that if we acquire the right objects, we'll become the right person. If we buy the expensive gym clothes, we'll become someone who exercises regularly. If we buy the professional wardrobe, we'll become more successful at work. If we buy the luxury car, we'll become someone worthy of respect. This is backwards. Identity doesn't flow from objects to self. It flows from behavior to self-concept to objects. You become someone who exercises by exercising, not by buying exercise equipment. You become successful by doing successful things, not by dressing like a successful person. But the retail industry has spent billions convincing us otherwise. Every advertisement is essentially selling you a version of yourself. Buy this and become this. Consider Jennifer, a recent college graduate who spent her first year's salary on designer clothes and accessories. She told herself she needed to dress for the job she wanted, but what she was really buying was relief from the anxiety of not feeling professional enough, smart enough, successful enough. The clothes didn't make her more professional, but they did make her feel temporarily less anxious about her professional identity. And that temporary relief was enough to keep her buying. This is the trap of identity-based spending. It provides short-term emotional relief while creating long-term financial and psychological problems. Because the identity you're trying to purchase is always just out of reach. There's always a more expensive version, a more prestigious brand, a more perfect object that will finally complete the picture of who you're trying to become. The luxury industry understands this psychology better than anyone. They're not selling objects. They're selling membership in an exclusive club, access to a rarefied identity, the promise of becoming someone special. This is why luxury brands spend so much on creating mystique around their products. The actual quality difference between a $500 handbag and a $5,000 handbag is minimal, but the identity difference, the story you get to tell yourself about who you are when you carry that handbag, is enormous. And that story is what you're really paying for. But there's an even deeper layer to identity-based spending. It's often driven by shame about who we actually are. When you feel inadequate, unsuccessful, or unworthy, buying objects associated with adequacy, success, or worthiness provides temporary relief from those feelings. The purchase doesn't change who you are, but it changes how you feel about who you are, at least momentarily. This is why people often go into debt for status symbols. The debt itself contradicts the financial success the status symbol is supposed to represent. But the emotional relief of temporarily feeling successful outweighs the rational recognition of the contradiction. Dr. Tim Kasser, a psychologist who studies materialism and well-being, has found that people who derive their self-worth from material possessions are more likely to experience anxiety, depression, and relationship problems. The very strategy they're using to feel better about themselves is actually undermining their psychological well-being. But here's what's hopeful. Once you understand that you're buying identity rather than objects, you can begin to ask different questions before you purchase. Instead of, "Do I want this?" you can ask, "Who do I think I'll become if I buy this?" Instead of, "Can I afford this?" you can ask, "What am I trying to prove with this purchase?" Because the person you're trying to become through purchasing already exists inside you. You don't need to buy access to that person. You need to give yourself permission to be that person without the objects. The confidence you're trying to buy with expensive clothes, you can develop it through accomplishment and self-acceptance. The success you're trying to display with luxury items, you can build it through skill development and meaningful work. The worthiness you're trying to prove with status symbols, you can claim it simply by recognizing that you already have it. This doesn't mean you should never buy nice things. It means you should buy them from a place of abundance rather than scarcity, from self-love rather than self-doubt, from who you are rather than who you're trying to become. Section 4. Retail Therapy and the Illusion of Self-Care. I deserve this. I've had a hard day. I need to treat myself. If you've ever justified a purchase with these words, you've experienced what marketers call retail therapy, the idea that shopping is a form of self-care, a way to nurture yourself, a legitimate response to life's difficulties. But retail therapy is one of the most sophisticated psychological manipulations in modern consumer culture. It takes a genuine human need, the need for comfort, care, and emotional regulation, and redirects it toward consumption. The concept of retail therapy didn't exist 50 years ago. It was created by marketers who recognized that if they could frame shopping as healthcare, as self-improvement, as an act of self-love, they could tap into a much deeper psychological need than simple desire for objects. Dr. Kit Yarrow's research reveals the mechanics of how this works. When you're feeling depleted, emotionally, physically, or psychologically, your brain craves restoration. In a healthy response, you might seek rest, connection with others, time in nature, creative expression, or physical movement. But retail therapy hijacks this restoration impulse and redirects it toward purchasing. The temporary mood boost you get from buying something feels like genuine self-care, even though it's actually the opposite. Real self-care builds your resources over time. It strengthens your emotional resilience, improves your relationships, enhances your well-being. Retail therapy depletes your resources over time. It weakens your financial security, creates emotional dependency on external objects, and often generates guilt and shame. But the illusion is powerful because the brain chemistry is similar. Both genuine self-care and retail therapy can trigger dopamine release and provide temporary mood elevation. The difference is in the long-term consequences. Consider Lisa, a nurse who works 12-hour shifts in a high-stress hospital environment. After particularly difficult days, she would stop at the mall and buy something: clothes, jewelry, home decor. She called it decompressing. She told herself she deserved nice things after dealing with so much stress and trauma. But the shopping wasn't actually helping her decompress. It was providing temporary distraction from the stress without addressing the underlying need for genuine rest and emotional processing. Over time, she found herself needing bigger purchases to achieve the same mood boost. And the financial pressure from her shopping habit became another source of stress in her already stressful life. This is the paradox of retail therapy. It promises relief from stress while creating more stress. It promises self-care while actually being a form of self-neglect. But the marketing around retail therapy is so pervasive that many people don't recognize it as marketing. They think the idea that shopping is self-care came from their own wisdom, their own understanding of what they need. The language of retail therapy has infiltrated our culture so completely that we use it unconsciously. I'm going shopping to cheer myself up. I need some retail therapy. Shopping is my stress relief. These phrases sound like personal choices, but they're actually the result of decades of psychological conditioning designed to make consumption feel like a natural response to emotional needs. Dr. April Lane Benson, who specializes in compulsive buying disorder, points out that real therapy involves understanding and processing emotions, not escaping from them. Retail therapy is actually the opposite of therapy. It's emotional avoidance disguised as emotional care. When you're sad, anxious, lonely, or overwhelmed, those emotions are carrying information. They're telling you something about your life, your relationships, your circumstances that needs attention. Retail therapy silences those emotions temporarily without addressing the information they're carrying. This is why retail therapy often leads to a cycle of repeated emotional distress. The underlying issues that triggered the difficult emotions remain unaddressed, so the emotions keep returning, often with increased intensity. But here's what's particularly insidious about retail therapy. It's often triggered by the very problems that shopping makes worse. Feeling financially insecure? Shopping provides temporary relief while worsening your financial situation. Feeling lonely or disconnected? Shopping provides temporary stimulation while keeping you isolated from real human connection. Feeling overwhelmed by possessions and clutter? Shopping provides temporary excitement while adding to the overwhelm. The solution becomes the problem, which requires more of the solution, which creates more of the problem. But recognizing retail therapy as a marketing concept, rather than a genuine form of self-care, opens up space for real alternatives. What if, instead of shopping when you're stressed, you took a walk in nature? What if, instead of buying something when you're sad, you called a friend? What if, instead of treating yourself with purchases, you treated yourself with experiences that genuinely nourish you? Real self-care doesn't require spending money. It requires spending attention to what you actually need, attention to what genuinely restores you, attention to what builds your long-term well-being, rather than just providing short-term relief. This doesn't mean you should never buy anything nice for yourself. It means you should distinguish between purchasing as genuine self-care and purchasing as emotional avoidance. Genuine self-care purchasing is thoughtful, intentional, and aligned with your values and long-term goals. It enhances your life without creating financial stress. It comes from a place of abundance rather than emptiness. Retail therapy, by contrast, is impulsive, emotionally driven, and often creates more problems than it solves. It comes from a place of depletion, and seeks to fill an emotional void with material objects. Learning to distinguish between these two is one of the most important skills you can develop in a consumer culture that profits from keeping you confused about the difference. Section 5. Breaking free from compulsive buying. The woman standing in Target at 2 a.m., cart full of things she doesn't need, represents millions of people trapped in patterns they don't fully understand. But Sarah's story doesn't end there. 6 months later, she would tell me that the moment she realized she was crying in a retail store over throw pillows was the moment she understood that her relationship with shopping had become something else entirely. Something that was controlling her rather than serving her. Breaking free from compulsive buying isn't about willpower. It's about understanding the psychological mechanisms that drive the behavior and developing alternative strategies for meeting the underlying emotional needs. Dr. April Lane Benson, who has worked with compulsive buyers for over 2 decades, identifies several key stages in recovery from shopping addiction. The first stage is recognition, understanding that the behavior has become problematic and serves functions beyond simply acquiring needed objects. This recognition is often the hardest part, because compulsive buying is so normalized in our culture. Unlike other addictions, shopping addiction is often celebrated, encouraged, and seen as a harmless hobby rather than a potentially destructive behavior pattern. But there are clear signs that shopping has crossed the line from healthy consumption to compulsive behavior. You might be engaging in compulsive buying if you frequently purchase things you don't need or use. If you shop to regulate emotions rather than to acquire specific items. If you feel anxious or irritated when you can't shop. If you lie about or hide your purchases from others. If your shopping creates financial problems or relationship conflicts. Most importantly, you might be engaging in compulsive buying if shopping has become your primary strategy for dealing with difficult emotions. Once you recognize the pattern, the next stage is understanding the triggers. What emotions, situations, or thoughts typically precede a shopping episode? For Sarah, the triggers were feelings of powerlessness and loneliness. For David, it was work stress and the fantasy of a more organized life. For Jennifer, it was anxiety about her professional identity. For Lisa, it was emotional exhaustion after difficult days at work. Understanding your triggers allows you to catch yourself earlier in the process, before the compulsion becomes overwhelming. But catching yourself is only the beginning. The next step is developing alternative responses to those triggers, ways of meeting the underlying emotional needs without resorting to purchasing. This is where most people get stuck, because they try to replace shopping with nothing, rather than replacing shopping with something else that actually addresses the emotional need. If you shop when you're stressed, you need alternative stress management strategies. If you shop when you're lonely, you need alternative ways of seeking connection. If you shop when you're bored, you need alternative sources of stimulation and engagement. The key is identifying what you're really seeking through shopping and finding healthier ways to seek it. Dr. Benson recommends what she calls shopping meditation, a practice of pausing before any purchase and asking yourself a series of questions. What am I feeling right now? What do I hope this purchase will do for me? What else might meet this need? How will I feel about this purchase tomorrow? Next week? Next month? These questions interrupt the automatic pattern and create space for conscious choice. But breaking free from compulsive buying also requires addressing the deeper psychological patterns that drive the behavior. Many people who struggle with compulsive buying have underlying issues with self-worth, emotional regulation, or trauma that make them particularly vulnerable to the temporary relief that shopping provides. Working with a therapist who understands addiction and consumer behavior can be invaluable in addressing these deeper patterns. There's also a practical component to recovery, creating environmental barriers to impulsive purchasing. This might mean deleting shopping apps from your phone, unsubscribing from retailer email lists, avoiding certain stores or websites, or implementing a waiting period before any non-essential purchase. Some people find it helpful to shop with a list and a specific budget, treating shopping like a business transaction rather than an emotional experience. Others find it helpful to shop with a trusted friend who can provide accountability and reality checking. The goal isn't to never buy anything. The goal is to return shopping to its proper function, acquiring things you actually need or genuinely want, rather than using it as a primary strategy for emotional regulation. But perhaps the most important aspect of breaking free from compulsive buying is developing a healthier relationship with emotions themselves. Our culture teaches us that negative emotions are problems to be solved rather than information to be processed. We're encouraged to avoid, escape, or eliminate difficult feelings rather than learning to tolerate and understand them. Compulsive buying is just one of many strategies people use to avoid emotional discomfort. Others include excessive eating, drinking, social media use, working, or exercising. Learning to sit with difficult emotions, to experience them without immediately seeking relief, is a fundamental life skill that our consumer culture actively discourages. But it's also the foundation of genuine emotional freedom. When you can tolerate sadness without needing to shop your way out of it, when you can experience anxiety without needing to buy something to calm yourself, when you can feel lonely without needing to fill the emptiness with objects, that's when you truly have choice about how you spend your money. Sarah learned this the hard way. After her divorce, she continued to struggle with emotional spending for months. But gradually, she began to recognize the pattern. She began to pause between feeling and buying. She began to ask herself what she really needed in moments of emotional distress. Often, what she really needed was to feel her feelings, to call a friend, to go for a walk, to write in her journal, or simply to sit quietly and let the emotion pass through her. The throw pillows couldn't provide any of those things, but recognizing that was the beginning of her freedom. Summary: the hidden addiction in plain sight. We began with Sarah, standing in Target at 2 a.m., her cart full of things she doesn't need, tears streaming down her face. Now you understand that her story isn't unique. It's the story of millions of people who have learned to use shopping as a drug, purchasing as a form of emotional regulation, consumption as a coping mechanism. But more importantly, you now understand the sophisticated psychological mechanisms that make this pattern so powerful and so difficult to recognize. You understand how dopamine creates anticipation that rarely matches reality, how cortisol shuts down rational decision-making under stress, how identity-based purchasing promises to make you into someone you're not, how retail therapy masquerades as self-care while actually depleting your resources. You understand that emotional spending isn't a character flaw or a lack of willpower. It's a learned response to emotional discomfort, reinforced by a culture that profits from keeping you confused about the difference between genuine needs and manufactured desires. But you also understand that patterns can be unlearned, that awareness creates choice, that you can develop healthier relationships with both your emotions and your money. The hidden addiction isn't really about shopping. It's about using external things to manage internal experiences. And once you see this pattern clearly, you can begin to make different choices. You can learn to pause between feeling and buying, You can develop alternative strategies for stress management, emotional regulation, and identity development. You can distinguish between genuine self-care and marketing-driven consumption. Most importantly, you can learn to tolerate difficult emotions without immediately seeking escape through purchasing. This doesn't mean you should never buy anything you enjoy. It means you should buy from a place of conscious choice rather than unconscious compulsion, from abundance rather than emptiness, from self-love rather than self-medication. The goal isn't to eliminate all emotional connection to objects. The goal is to ensure that objects serve you, rather than you serving the compulsion to acquire objects. Sarah's story has a different ending now. She still shops, but she shops consciously. She still feels difficult emotions, but she has learned to feel them without immediately seeking relief through consumption. The throw pillows are still in her house, but they no longer represent an attempt to purchase emotional stability. They're just throw pillows. And that simple shift, from symbolic to practical, from emotional to functional, represents a profound change in her relationship with both shopping and herself. Your relationship with money and consumption doesn't have to be driven by unconscious patterns developed in childhood and reinforced by sophisticated marketing. You can develop conscious, intentional relationships with both your emotions and your purchases. You can learn to recognize when you're shopping for things versus shopping for feelings. You can develop the emotional skills necessary to process difficult feelings without immediately seeking escape. You can create the environmental supports necessary to make conscious choices rather than automatic responses. The hidden addiction is only hidden until you see it clearly. Once you understand the mechanisms, you have the power to change the patterns. And that power, the power to choose how you respond to your own emotions, is worth more than anything you could ever purchase. The frequencies embedded in this audio will continue working long after you've finished listening, gently reprogramming your subconscious relationship with money, consumption, and emotional regulation. Remember, awareness is the first step toward freedom. You now have tools to recognize emotional spending patterns as they arise, to pause between feeling and purchasing, to distinguish between genuine needs and manufactured desires. Your journey toward conscious consumption and emotional freedom is just beginning. Trust the process. Trust yourself. And remember that every moment of awareness, every conscious pause, every intentional choice is a step toward the financial and emotional freedom you deserve. Let these insights settle into your subconscious mind, where they can guide your future decisions with wisdom and clarity.